Your first impression of Attica Correctional Facility might be a cold block of concrete, gray against the sky, surrounded by razor wire and guard towers. But in September 1971, it was much more than a prison. It was a tinderbox. At that moment in time, Attica was overcrowded. The population far exceeded what the facility was designed to hold. Men were double and triple bunked in cells meant for fewer bodies. Heat was inconsistent, showers were limited, medical care was slow and often absent. Day after day, tensions mounted. Prison isn't just about confinement, it's about conditions, and conditions become pressure. In the months leading up to September, small incidents rippled through the prison. Reports from inside noted fights over food portions. Medical complaints went unheeded. Words passed between men about unfair treatment. Security officers maintained a rigid routine, showing neither frustration nor empathy. Rules were strict on paper and inconsistent in practice. The gap between what was promised and what was lived grew wider. Attica reflected broader tensions in American society at the time. Inequality, neglect, and the absence of meaningful voice were concentrated within walls designed to keep people out of sight. On the morning of September 9, 1971, something shifted. The catalyst was not a single dramatic act or one violent confrontation. It was collective exhaustion. A moment when enough men decided that waiting any longer for change meant accepting that nothing would change. It began quietly, not with a shout or a command, but with a shared refusal to continue routine movement. Men gathered with intention. Within minutes, sections of the prison were under informal control of the inmates themselves. Officers on duty were overwhelmed by the speed and coordination. The movement was organized rather than chaotic.
Approximately 42 officers and civilian employees were taken hostage. This was not done as an act of random violence, but as leverage. The men involved understood that attention and negotiation only came when the lives of those inside the system mattered to those outside it. The demands that followed were direct and rooted in basic dignity. Improved living conditions, proper medical care, fair visitation rights, an end to physical abuse, access to education, reform of parole processes. These demands were not abstract. They reflected conditions experienced daily inside the facility. Negotiations began. Prison officials, inmate representatives, lawyers, and outside observers communicated over several days. Some demands were accepted in principle, others were rejected, including calls for amnesty. For a brief period, there was an appearance that a peaceful resolution might be possible. Beneath the surface, divisions remained. Not all inmates agreed on every demand. Not all officials were prepared to enact meaningful reform. Negotiation required trust, and trust had been eroded long before September. On September 13, 1971, the situation reached a breaking point. State authorities ordered the prison to be retaken by force. Armored vehicles, tear gas, rifles, and hundreds of law enforcement officers were deployed to end the uprising. The objective was to regain control of the facility. What followed was not a controlled restoration of order, it was a violent assault. Gunfire erupted as authorities advanced. Although a small number of hostages and inmates were armed, the majority of those killed were struck by bullets fired during the retaking operation. 43 people died in total. 33 inmates and 10 hostages lost their lives. Most fatalities were the result of law enforcement gunfire. Many others were injured and carried physical and psychological trauma long after the event. The scale of the violence made the Attica uprising the deadliest prison confrontation in United States history. The outcome was not defined only by the loss of life,
but by what the event revealed about the system that contained it. The uprising forced public attention onto prison conditions that had long been ignored. It raised questions about overcrowding, medical neglect, and the absence of legitimate channels for prisoners to express grievances. The violent conclusion highlighted how quickly state power could be applied when negotiations failed. After the retaking of the facility, multiple investigations were launched. Some were conducted by state authorities. Others came from independent bodies and journalists. Findings pointed to excessive use of force, delays in providing medical care to the wounded, and conflicting accounts of what occurred during and after the assault. Official statements emphasized the restoration of order. Independent reviews documented unnecessary brutality and failures in accountability. These conflicting narratives became part of the historical record. Both remain preserved in archives and reports. The events at Attica did not end when the prison was retaken. Lawsuits followed. Families of the dead sought compensation. Documents revealed orders that authorized lethal force. Testimonies described how wounded inmates were denied timely medical assistance. The legal and moral consequences extended for decades. The uprising became a case study in criminal justice programs and a symbol in broader debates about incarceration in the United States. It demonstrated how prolonged neglect and the absence of meaningful reform could culminate in sudden, catastrophic confrontation. Attica did not stand alone. Conditions similar to those that fueled the uprising existed in many facilities across the country. What made Attica different was visibility. The world saw what happened. Journalists reported not only the violence, but the conditions that preceded it. Families demanded answers. Public discourse shifted. The records that remain from that period show how differently the same event was understood by those inside the system and those who controlled it. One side emphasized the need for security and order. The other emphasized dignity and basic rights. The distance between those perspectives shaped how the event would be remembered. The legacy of Attica lies not only in the number of lives lost, but in the questions it forced into the open. It challenged assumptions about punishment, reform, and the responsibilities of institutions toward those they confine. It showed that when pressure is allowed to build without relief, the result is not stability, but rupture.
In the days that followed the retaking of Attica, the silence around the prison felt heavier than the gunfire that had ended the uprising. The yard where men had stood together was now empty. The walls bore marks of the assault. The air carried the residue of tear gas and smoke. What remained was not order, but aftermath. Survivors were processed again, this time under conditions that many later described as humiliating and brutal. Men were lined up, searched repeatedly, questioned while injured, and kept waiting for medical attention. Some wounds were visible, others were not. Fear did not end when the shooting stopped. It changed shape. Inside institutions, fear becomes routine. After Attica, routine returned quickly. Counts resumed, movement was controlled, cells were secured. The system restored its procedures, but the meaning of those procedures had changed for many who witnessed what happened. Outside the walls, the story was still forming. Early official statements misrepresented key details. Initial claims suggested that hostages had been killed by inmates. Autopsies later showed that nearly all of those deaths were caused by gunfire from the retaking forces. This discrepancy did not disappear quietly. It reshaped public understanding of the event. Records show that information was slow to correct. Corrections came through investigative reporting, court proceedings, and the persistence of families seeking truth.
The distance between the first narrative and the later findings became part of the legacy. It showed how quickly public perception can be guided by authority and how slowly it changes when confronted with evidence. Legal actions followed. Survivors and families pursued accountability. Years of litigation unfolded. Settlements were reached decades later. The passage of time did not erase the harm. It changed how it was processed. In criminal justice programs, Attica became a case that students were asked to examine not for spectacle, but for structure. Overcrowding, medical neglect, racial imbalance among staff and inmates, limited grievance procedures. Each element was documented before the uprising. Each element was known. None were addressed in time to prevent the rupture. This pattern is not unique to Attica. Institutions change slowly when pressure is abstract. They change abruptly when pressure becomes visible. Visibility arrived at Attica through violence, not through reform. That distinction matters.
Within the prison system, changes were proposed after 1971. Some facilities expanded grievance processes. Some adjusted visitation policies. Some reviewed medical protocols. These changes were uneven. Implementation varied by state and facility. Reform did not move at the pace of tragedy. The men who lived through Attica carried forward a specific understanding of how systems respond to pressure. They learned that negotiation is fragile when trust is absent. They learned that visibility can force attention but does not guarantee protection. They learned that narratives formed quickly and corrected slowly. For correctional staff, Attica also left a mark. Training materials changed. Emergency response protocols were rewritten. The event became a reference point in discussions about crowd control, negotiation strategies, and the risks of escalation. The lesson was not simply that force is dangerous. It was that misjudging pressure creates conditions where force becomes the chosen solution. Public memory of Attica shifted over time. Early portrayals emphasized chaos. Later accounts emphasized conditions. The shift did not happen because memory changed. It happened because records accumulated. Reports, testimonies, and investigations built a more complete picture. The event became less about a single day and more about a system that had been signaling distress for years. The most persistent effect of Attica was not a single reform. It was the introduction of scrutiny. Journalists returned to prisons with different questions. Advocacy groups referenced Attica when arguing for oversight. Families of incarcerated people used it as evidence that closed systems require external accountability. Attica also altered how uprisings were interpreted in public discourse. After 1971, it became harder to frame prison unrest as spontaneous disorder without acknowledging the conditions that preceded it. The language changed slowly. Responsibility expanded beyond individuals to institutions. None of this reversed the loss of life. None of it restored what was taken from those who were killed or injured. What it did was place a permanent record in the archive, a record that shows how pressure accumulates when grievances are ignored, a record that shows how quickly violence replaces negotiation when trust collapses, a record that shows how narratives can conceal facts until evidence forces correction. The lesson of Attica is not that rebellion is inevitable. It is that neglect creates the conditions where rupture becomes likely. Systems that rely on silence as stability eventually discover that silence can break. Attica stands as a reference point because it made hidden conditions visible. It did so at a cost that cannot be undone. The visibility forced conversations that had been deferred. It placed institutional responsibility into public view. It documented the consequences of delayed reform.
When people ask what really happened at Attica, the answer is not contained in one moment of violence. It is contained in years of ignored signals, days of fragile negotiation, minutes of irreversible decisions, and decades of reckoning. The archive does not present Attica as an isolated failure. It presents it as a warning preserved in record. The warning is simple and difficult to accept. Systems that confine people without effective channels for dignity and redress do not remain stable. They accumulate pressure. When pressure finds no release, it finds rupture. That is what happened at Attica.